in a second, and we're live. Let me just double check if this is working. Okay, so second, I want to make sure this is transmitting. We can start, I think. So, hello everybody, and welcome to the first conversation with World Philosophy, Rethinking Humanity, and Rethinking Nature. Hello everybody. I'm going to introduce our participants. First, we have Professor Roman Pasha from Kyoto University, specialist in Japanese philosophy. He's also the vice president of the European Network of Japanese Philosophy. It's a pleasure to have you here, Professor Pasha. And we have Juan Camilo Cajigas from the Humboldt Institute in Bogota. Juan Camilo works environmental philosophy and has worked both with Japanese philosophy and Indian philosophy. Professor Cajigas, we're glad to have you here. And I'm Felipe Cuervo from the University of El Bosque. I've recently been working Japanese philosophy and philosophy of nature, though when it comes to nature, I've been working more from the side of German idealism, and I'm one of the organizers of conversations with World Philosophy. So it's a pleasure to have everybody here. And today's conversation is about, in general, how humans relate with nature. Basically, there are a couple of questions. We won't exactly be answering them, but they will be guiding our discussion. The questions are as follows. Do our ethical duties towards nature include anything beyond our needing nature in order to survive? If so, does this in any way imply nature as an ethical subject? Is there any relation between natural ethics and natural aesthetics? Does the ease with which we can adopt an aesthetic attitude towards nature make it easier to adopt an ethical attitude towards nature? Must we reformulate the difference between nature and culture in order to adopt an ethical attitude towards nature? What does this imply for the way we understand what it is to be a human being? And when it comes to environmental ethics, typically there are two solutions: applying an existing ethical theory to the environment or creating a new one. At first sight, the second solution seems to be more appropriate as it apparently allows for an ethical theory that is not anthropocentric. But is that really so? Is a non-anthropocentric ethical theory even possible? Now, the discussion will work as follows. Um, each one of us will have around 15 minutes to answer something similar to these questions, at least. Then we'll discuss among ourselves for about half an hour. And then there will be half an hour for questions. Questions can be asked via the chat, both in the English and the Spanish transmission. Just in case, for those of you who feel a little more comfortable listening in Spanish, keep in mind that in the same YouTube channel, there is another live feed which has simultaneous translation in Spanish. So that's it. And perhaps we shall begin with Professor Pasha.
Good morning, everybody. I'm saying good morning because it's like 7 a.m. in Japan right now. And thank you to Felipe and Juan for inviting me to do this. I'm actually really excited about this. I'm honored to be a part of this project. And I'm excited about it because I think we're on different continents, different time zones, different areas of this planet Earth. But here we are talking to each other in real time. And I think I find the topic absolutely fascinating. It's something that we should be thinking about. It's something that we should be reflecting on. And so I'm excited, but at the same time, this is the first time that I'm doing this. So I'm a little bit nervous, not only about the technical parts, but about, my talk, what I'm going to say. I hope I make sense. Okay. So thank you again for inviting me. And what do we do next? Should we wait for a couple of minutes for people to join the live stream, or should I just start talking?
Let me check whether we have people in the live stream. If the people are already there, I believe we can start. Just give me a second. Um, so, let's see. Seems there are a couple of people already watching it. So I think, we were supposed to start 10 minutes ago, so I think that's time enough for those interested to have shown up. So I believe we can start. So, Roman, if you please.
Okay. So here we go. I'll try to keep it. You said about 15 minutes, right?
Yes.
Sometimes I'll try to keep it short because sometimes when I talk about a topic that I'm interested in, I tend to just keep on talking and just go over time. But I'll try to keep it short. Okay. And I'll try to talk a little bit, not to talk too fast. I understand there's live translation happening as well, right? So, okay. I'm going to try and I'm a translator myself, so I know how hard it is for translators to work in real time. Okay, so first of all, thank you for the questions. The questions that Felipe, you mentioned a little bit earlier about how we basically what these questions, I feel that what these questions have in common is that they all focus on this topic, on this idea of what kind of relationship we can or we should, as human beings, have with nature, and what is our role, what is our function within nature. Are we within nature? Are we outside of nature? Where are we? Now, I don't know if I can answer these questions in a satisfactory way, but they got me thinking. And in the 15 minutes that I have, I would just like to talk very briefly about something that I've been working on recently. Felipe, as you said, I do Japanese philosophy. I'm a specialist in Japanese philosophy. And for the last few years, actually, I've been working on a research project that has to do with this. The relationship between human beings and nature and environmental ethics in this context of Japanese philosophy. So I'm trying, a lot of people have been talking recently about the global environmental crisis. I was just watching the news the other day. There was, where was it? In Greenland, I think, or in the Arctic, there was another huge glacier that just started floating in the sea. So the ice cap kind of keeps on shrinking. You have the fires in the United States right now. We had the fires in Australia last year. So things are not looking good. And in environmental ethics, you already have philosophers, scholars who have started talking about this environmental crisis as an existential crisis. Because, of course, it affects the environment, but at the same time, it affects so much more than that because it changes, or it will change, the way we are in the world. So our very mode of existence in the world is not just the way we relate to the environment, but it's also it has started to affect, or it will affect in the near future, the way we interact with each other, the way we lead our daily lives, and so on and so forth. And to clarify my position, I do agree that this is an existential crisis. So I do think that this is an existential crisis. And I think that our duty, if you want, as philosophers, is to reflect on it. We may not have the same perspective as, I don't know, people who are specialists in ecosystems, for example. They might have a different perspective, a different take on things. But my belief is that philosophy can bring some can add something to the discussion about this environmental / existential crisis. And since I'm working on Japanese philosophy, my perspective is that we can look for hints. This is actually what I'm trying to do, look for hints in Japanese philosophy, especially pre-modern Japanese philosophy, stuff that might help us understand the crisis, try to deal with it, and maybe find a sort of framework, a new kind of framework that might help us reassess our relation with nature, with climate change, with the environment, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to talk very briefly about a philosopher, maybe two if I have time, but just one. For starters, a philosopher that I've been actually translating as well, who is a pre-modern Japanese philosopher, whose name is Ando Shoeki. I don't know if it's important to show you the name or anything. I can share my screen. I can try to. It's okay?
Don't worry, I can write it here on the chat. No problem.
Okay.
I'll take care of that.
Okay, perfect. So, the thing that I wanted to say today, given the fact that I don't have a lot of time, so just a couple of things about this Shoeki person. My interest in his philosophy started with his notion of the human being, which is kind of interesting. So he's an 18th century philosopher. Now, if you're familiar with the situation in Japan in the 18th century, the dominant philosophical tradition is Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism to be more specific, which has a very hierarchical, I'm simplifying, but Confucianism has a very hierarchical view of society, and the roles of men and women, for example, are clearly differentiated, and there's a certain subordination there. I'm simplifying, but this is basically in a nutshell what Confucianism says. And against this background, this ideological background, you have Ando Shoeki, who comes and says men and women are equal. In fact, he proposes a new understanding of the human being, where he says you cannot talk of men and women as separate entities, because they are like the two sides of the same coin. That's the simplest explanation that I have about his philosophy. So he comes and says, even when we write, when we talk in our discourse about human beings, we cannot treat them, men and women, as separate beings. And he even goes so far as to try and change the language, the way in which he writes all these things. So he creates, in many cases, he creates new concepts and new words and new ideographs for this. And he writes men and women as the two ideographs. He puts them together, but he says this should not be read men and women, but this should be read hito, which is the Japanese word for man, human being. So this was my gateway into Ando Shoiki's philosophy, because I was interested in this concept of the human being. But as I was reading, I realized that what he's actually doing there is to propose a new way of seeing the world. And that's actually relevant for environmental ethics, because in the end, re-examining or thinking about our relationship with nature means re-examining ourselves. It means to re-examine our humanity in the end. So from that concept of the human being that Shoiki introduced in his works, I started to expand a little bit and try to look into his understanding of nature. And the more you read, so reading, I realized that, for example, his idea that men and women are two sides of the same coin doesn't just come out of nowhere, because in his philosophy, he also talks about a concept of mutual natures. The idea behind this concept of mutual natures in his philosophy is that any two different, distinct entities, whatever they are, men and women in this case, or the energies that circulate around in the universe, even if apparently they are opposing entities or contradictory entities, each of them contains within itself the essence of the other. So he's saying, because I started with the example of men and women, he's saying man contains within himself the essence of woman, and woman contains within herself the essence of man. So you cannot talk about them as separate, distinct entities. You have to take them together as a pair, as something that has fused together, has been fused together. That's mutual natures, this idea of reciprocity. And then he actually suggests that this mutual natures, this concept of mutual natures, is the only way in which everything in nature can actually interact with each other. And at first, he keeps the first level or layer of this kind of relationship is between two entities. Because I started with men and women, let me stick to this. So that's the first level. So you have one man, one woman. They have mutual natures, which means you have to consider them as one single entity that has been fused together. But since this mutual natures is the only way in which we can interact with each other in Shoiki's philosophy, that means that entity one, the first men and women that have come together as one human being, and entity two, another men and woman come together as a human being, the relationship that's established again between them is one of mutual natures. So to try to keep it simple, not make things too complicated, what he's actually doing here in his philosophy is to suggest that I'm going to use the concept of self for this, but he's suggesting that there is this sort of universal self, if you want, or there are different layers of the self. One, the basic one is the one of the only individual, but it gets expanded because this one individual can only function through mutual natures in its relationship with the other individuals. So myself as a human being, for example, is in a relationship of mutual natures with Felipe's self and with Juan's self. we have this, it's not a collective self, but it's undifferentiated for Shoeki. And to take things a little bit further and end my intervention, he also says that human beings are part of nature. Human beings do not exist outside of nature. And human beings, the only way, and since that relationship of mutual natures obtains between all elements in nature, I'm sorry, he actually suggests that this idea of interaction, this interactive kind of self, obtains beyond sentient beings. So it extends to non-human entities as well. So I call that self a self with others, because as I was saying, myself is at the same time Felipe's self and Juan's self. If I look into Shoeki's philosophy. But Shoeki also tells us that this self with others becomes expanded to a self with everything. It moves beyond the realm of the human. It moves beyond the realm of sentient beings. I, as a human being, am in this relationship of mutual natures with all other human beings, but at the same time, myself is also defined in terms of my relationship with the tree or with the flower or with any other element of nature. There is no differentiation there. And that's the self, what I call the self with everything. So what Shoeki is actually suggesting here is that we should, this is my speculation, but his suggestion is that we should actually overhaul our whole understanding of our relationship with nature. Even when we talk about, this was actually in one of the questions again, I think it was the last question. When we talk about our relationship with nature and we try to think of environmental ethics, usually we position ourselves as human beings outside of nature. We take this, to a certain extent, arrogant attitude that we as sentient beings, or we as intelligent mammals, or we as human beings, we have the right or we have the duty to come up with a set of ethical principles that we or everybody should respect when it comes to nature. But that seems nice. Right? It's a very good idea, of course. But the perspective is of an outsider. We are outside of nature when we do that. This is what Shoeki would say. It's not okay. We should understand that we are part of it. We are inside. We are human beings because we are part of nature. And the environmental crisis is an existential crisis precisely for that reason. So I don't know if it's not, what Shoeki gives us is not practical advice. He's not telling us you should do this, you should do that, and the situation will be better. He's giving us hints that might help us understand or reframe our relationship with the environment. And the major hint, the most important hint that I find in his philosophy is this idea of the self with everything. We need to understand that we are not alone, and we are part of this whole system of nature. And our humanity, our self as human beings, is defined with respect to that, in relation with that. And we cannot exclude elements of nature out of who we are. So when I say rethinking our relation with the environment means reconsidering our humanity as well, this is what I mean by that. It means understanding that our humanity is actually defined by this very relationship with nature. Okay, I hope this makes sense. I'm going to stop here because I think this is, it's about 15 minutes. I'm going to stop here. It's just a short introduction to Shoiki's philosophy, but maybe I can add some more ideas later during the discussion. So I'm going to stop here.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roman. That was very, very interesting. And yes, certainly we'll pick a lot of themes up again once we start the discussion amongst us. So, Juan Camilo, if you please, you have your more or less 15 minutes.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I'm going to time myself. What I'm going to do is first make a short introduction, explaining where I come from in this conversation, and then I'm simply going to read one short section of my dissertation, where I use the philosophy, the Kitaro Nishida philosophy. Basically, I come from, let's say, I was doing an ethnography in the cloud forest Tequendama Valley in Colombia. So I was working in private natural reserves, and the way in those private reserves, they develop some conservation strategies, which imply also agroecology strategies. So I was working with people and trying to know what we're doing and how this become a very important strategy of conservation nowadays that complements the more state-based strategies. So I was trying to understand what is the connection between people and place in order to trigger those conservation practices. So that's the first point. And the second is that I was in a very weird place, which is between science and technology studies, environmental philosophy, and with all of and cultural studies also. So in a very interdisciplinary place in California. And I came across with this idea of transcultural empirical philosophy, honoring some tradition of thought in Latin America and in Australia. So I was kind of taking resources for multiple thinking processes and traditions. So one of those was Ricardo Rossi in Chile, who was doing something he calls empirical philosophy environmental philosophy from the field in a natural reserve in Chile. And the other thinker was Helen Berran as well, who does this. She created the notion of empirical philosophy, which is basically how you put concepts to work, right? And how you see concepts are not divorced from empirical situations. And I think I found interesting that this is something very timely in our environmental crisis and existential crisis, as Roman says. So this is more or less the theoretical context. In this sense, I found the two notions, the notion of affective ecology, which is the way people and even organisms establish relationships with each other. So it will be like maybe some parallel and similarity between what Roman was saying and what I found. So this affective ecology allows us to don't think in ethics as an abstract rules, but something that is incorporated. It's something that is also in place, right? So in the conservation literature, it is important to know why people is attached to those specific and biodiverse places. So in that literature, there is a notion of sense of place, but this notion of sense of place like follows the tradition, the Western tradition of representational thinking, right? And I found that that we can expand on that discussion. So there it comes the notion of Kitaro Nishida of Basho. So Basho, and as I will show in my reading, explain this deep connection between people and place that goes beyond this sense of place as understood as something that is clearly a representational, abstract notion between the idea that we have of nature. And so, and that explains for me what trigger political actions in those conservation and agroecological projects. So that means I was taking a different approach to environmental ethics. What I found in environmental ethics usually is the idea of the extensionist perspective on environmental ethics, which means, as Roman was saying, we are detached from nature, and the project is to protect nature out there by extending liberal rights. So that liberal rationality supposes an individual human knower and experiencer that extends its moral sensibility and rationality to non-human entities. So it means nature as a radical otherness, right? And also nature is something that is pivotal around which we project these abstract rules. But that was what I didn't find that in my ethnography, right? So I found this deep connection between people and place expressed through different statements and through the agroecological practices. So I need to look for a non-dual framework that allowed me to understand these practices. And there I found interesting Kitaro Nishida notion of Basho. So that's the historical and theoretical background of the way I'm trying to establish a conversation with Japanese philosophy. I'm not a Nishida scholar. I'm not doing an exegesis of Nishida's thinking. I'm trying to think with Nishida from these conservation and agroecological practices. So, being saying that, I'm going to read. I think that allows me to explain better. So, the notion of affective ecology has been recently theorized by science and technology scholars. They argue that multi-species relationships are not based on evolutionary processes which follow economic models of fitness. Rather, an affective ecology signals an involutionary momentum where multiple improvisations among forms of life guarantee life's continuity. Studying plant-insect relationships, these authors define affective ecologies as the encounter between organisms taking into account bodily expressions that allow chemical communication. Affective ecologies emerge in the encounter among human and non-human organisms, including scientists, plants, and insects. These scholars open up the scope for such fleshy interactions. In a particular way, plants do listen and speak for them. They participate in the mental process of creating differences. Correspondingly, insects respond to these differences. Affective ecology means the improvisational encounter in which organisms' capacities become attuned to each other. It is a dance of fleshy interactions. Attunement to perceptual and affective difference demands the ability to respond. So this is one stream of the affective ecology literature. We can find other streams where this emotional or affective non-representational side of human activity is very important to understand political actions, as I mentioned. So my presentation aims to connect Nishida's perspective here. The world itself, understood as creative activity, expresses itself through these affective assemblages. However, there is a place located virtually under any subject of experience, the realm of undifferentiated experience. That is, the realm of experience of the world before any subject is composed. Such an empty space is an abysmal nothingness in which subjects and predicates emanate as folded entities. If one disposes of both Western metaphysics of the subject-object and Aristotelian elemorphism for matter, and establishes as a starting point the contradictory self-awareness of the world from consciousness to self-consciousness, it is possible to understand affective ecologies not as the multiple sensible becoming among organisms, but rather as the consequence of the activity of an independent sphere of existence from which affects arise, allowing interspecies communication. Such a sphere of existence is located, as previously mentioned, virtually under the subject, before knots of relations, that is, basho, the place of nothingness, the very ground of being. We tend to think that the subject experiences the world. Instead, one can think of experience without any subject. The subject comes after the experience emanates. There is a field of pure experience that produces a given subject. Such a realm of existence and experience is the experience of the world, embodied in difference and multiplicity. This realm of existence that produces impersonal experience themselves is a groundless ground. It is an empty field from which different phenomena emanates. I would like to speculate that affects come from these existential spheres of existence where we are always already in place. This is precisely the place from which affects emanate as place self-differentiations, that is, as transductions of different levels of basho/place. Affects emanate from this impersonal sphere of pure or undifferentiated experience. For instance, love as an affect is the dissolution of the subject in this groundless ground of reality. Nishida's reflections on love emphasize such dissolution. Quote, when we are absorbed in something the self loves, for example, we are almost totally unconscious. We forget the self, and at this point, an incomprehensible power beyond the self functions alone in all of its majesty. Unquote. What is commonly termed as love is a moment of deep connection with this sphere of existence. The emplacement of experience in basho/place, the unfolding dynamic of place, is the groundless ground of affective ecologies. That was my hypothesis. Therefore, various beings and entities share in different degrees the experience of the world, which Nishida called partial mirroring of the experience of the world, as being in place in basho, place, meaning the qualitative differential unfolding of place grounded in a groundless reality, which includes animals, plants, and stones. When Don Pedro, in my ethnography, in the Tequendama Valley, speaks about the way nature speaks and teach him, that's the way he refers to his interaction, I interpret these statements as coming from a deep experience which at some level expresses the event of pure and differentiated experience. He is emplaced in the qualitative differential unfolding of place event, which I have been also referring to as the forest regionality. From this perspective, affective ecologies are defined as fundamentally emplaced, that is, as participating in the deep corporeal communication among bodies of different kinds that crystallize the unfolding dynamic of place. The unfolding dynamic of place might be further clarified while referring to field theory in physics, which Nishida understood as a fairly good illustration of his notion of basho/place. I'm translating basho as place, following some readers of Nishida, such as Robert Bargo. So entities, organisms, stones, objects that are affectively related to each other are not just located in a physical space. That is, relations not only occur in the background of physical space. Thinking with the idea of basho, place, it is possible to conceive of a tighter relation between entities and the place where those entities are located. Entities are determinations of place as it unfolds. Place has a generative character that encompasses those entities. The substantiality of entities is determined by the place they belong to. As this scholar, and as the Nishida scholar Vargo says, one might refer to field theory in physics. Newtonian physics allows us to understand the relationship between entities and space merely as being in. However, in field theory, those relations are established by the field in which, I'm quoting, are established by the field in which the relationships hold. The relations are thus said to be internal to the field. And since the field is itself not just the point of view of any particular concentration, it provides the unity of the various concentrations of energy. Unquote. The field force is an example of what Nishida refers to as basho, which allows entities to be determinations of basho. Entities are concentrations of energy within into a force field. Every force field, or in this case, basho/place, has its own determinations. As a consequence, singularity is a characteristic of every single place, since it is the manifestation of such particular form of determination. An entity is a mode of the field where such entity is in place. Hence, one might assert that relations are prior to entities, but prior to relations, there is active emplacement, basho. So I end my reading there. So this is the point. Nowadays, in the discussion of environmental ethics and science and technology studies and many other discussions, we are very focused on the notion of relationality. But what I found with Kitaro Nishida is that he conceives relationality. There is something prior to this kind of relationality. We relate among each other in virtue of our active emplacement in particular place. So that's allowed me to understand how empirically there is a tighter relation between people and place in my ethnography that establish a kind of affective notion of ethics where or constituted by a practice of belonging and intimacy and reciprocity. Okay, thanks very much. I leave it there.
Thank you very much, Juan Camilo. That was certainly very interesting, and it's especially interesting in a conversation on philosophy to hear somebody who has practical experience. That doesn't happen quite so often. I'll give my own short presentation now. Please, my connection sometimes fails. If I start to cut up, please let me know so I can stop and wait a second. First I have to make a confession. I have sort of a professional disease. It's called metaphysics. I do metaphysics. I'm sort of addicted to metaphysics. So that's kind of what's going to happen right now. So I actually began considering the problem of nature and our relation to nature through the philosophy of Schelling. Now, for those of you who don't know, Schelling's first philosophical works, actually, I mean, he wrote something like 6 or 7 books before he was 25. Those he wrote between the years of 20 and 24 or something of the sort, have to do with the nature of nature. Now, Schelling is interested in nature because for him it presents a challenge for Kant's transcendental idealism. You see, as probably everybody kind of knows, I'm not sure Kant knew very much what he was saying, so kind of is good enough. As we all kind of know, Kant solved the problem of skepticism by saying, wait a second, we don't face an object out there and receive everything from the world, but rather we impose a set of categories on the world in order to make objects possible. Now, this is an extreme simplification, I know. And nevertheless, Kant said, so we do have knowledge of what we impose upon the world, but there is a part of the world behind, before, it's difficult to explain, our imposition of categories and intuitions, and that the thing in itself will forever remain beyond knowledge. Now, Schelling found that very problematic because he felt Kant hadn't answered anything. If that was Kant's position, he had failed. And Schelling said, actually, Kant misunderstood himself. What Kant should have said is, wait, subject knowledge is possible because that which is known and the act of knowing are one and the same thing, correct? It's not two things that bump into each other in some kind of pre-epistemological world, but the creation of knowledge as a phenomenon having two sides by an initial identity. That initial identity would be nature. Nature, in Schelling's view, would be the condition of possibility for knowledge to emerge. In a sense, then, knowledge is the result of nature finding a way of reflecting upon itself. Nature becoming dual in order for knowledge to become possible. Now, this sounds very strange, and I don't want to go into too many details regarding Schelling's philosophy, but the problem is still there. And Schelling, this idea of nature being an initial whole, which then breaks up into subject and object, seems very satisfactory in as far as it answers our questions, but it also seems, in a sense, sort of a trick on words. You know? You're telling us everything begins as one, but you're not demonstrating. It would be wonderful if things began as one, but we have no reason to believe what you're saying. And at this point, I discovered Buddhist philosophy, Japanese Buddhist philosophy. For those of you who know some Japanese philosophy, perhaps what I have been saying sounds a little like what Dogen was saying. Just a second, so I'll write his name over here, just in case. So Dogen was very insistent when he said, when discussing the nature of illumination, how do we acquire a state of illumination? How do we reach nirvana, or however you want to call it? And Dogen criticized those of his contemporaries who believed that we sort of left this world and encountered a different world, or reached nirvana because we saw God, or we saw something beyond us. Dogen, at least as Masao Abe, for example, interprets him, seems to say this, once again, is not an answer. The problem with illumination is we're at a distance from the world. We're at a distance from God, from truth, from happiness, from whatever you want. Now, we don't want to be at a distance. In order to become illuminated, we want to become one with it. Now, if we continue postulating the existence of paradise, nirvana, God, etc., we are imposing a permanent distance between our own subject and whatever it is we want to know. If we want to reach, if illumination is possible, and of course he believed it was, then necessarily illumination must come, in a sense, from within. But then within us is mere individuality. Dogen's answer was saying, when we reach illumination, it's not that the subject becomes illuminated in the world, but that nature becomes illuminated with the subject, through the subject. That which surrounds the subject, the world, reaches enlightenment when the subject reaches enlightenment. They both must reach enlightenment simultaneously. Now, this still sounds a bit complicated, perhaps nicer than what Schelling was saying, at least, more inviting, but it still sounds a little abstract until we keep in mind, or we try to explain the nature of the subject. The problem with understanding both Dogen and Schelling is that we usually believe that the subject is an object. We tend to consider ourselves as objects that have both spatial and temporal extension, correct? When somebody says, who is Felipe? I usually answer, Felipe is such and such years old, he's currently near Bogota, et cetera, he's, going bald and pretending he's not, so he lets his hair grows long, et cetera. But that, a lot of people would tell us, among them Sartre and Nishtani, Keiji Nishtani, is not actually the subject. We know we are a subject, not because we have a history, not because we have hair, not because we have parents and school years, but because we can intentionally direct ourselves towards the world. What we usually consider the subject is actually something which we discover when we direct our own intentionality towards reality. What we usually consider the subject is nothing more than another possible object of intentionality. The subject is not an object. The subject is not an entity. The subject is a function, correct? The subject is the function of being directed towards something, and being directed in the widest sense possible. Liking is being directed, thinking of, remembering, all of this is being directed towards. So, and because, rather unfortunately, we tend to think of reality in terms inherited from natural sciences, we tend to believe that in order for a function to exist, there needs to be a functioning entity. What these philosophers have been trying to teach us is that's false. Right? That's a misconception. We believe there is a world of stable objects that act because first we are directed towards that world, construct the world in that sense. We impose our categories, in order to go back to Kant, the category of substantiality, and then we assume that everything must be a substance. But the subject, understood as a function, is prior to the existence of substances. So the result is the subject would be nothing more than the world being presented in a certain way, correct? The subject is, in other words, thus, or suchness. That is the way the term is usually translated from Buddhist studies. The world is there is something that is present. And in this something, of course, being present, or rather, being present is not merely a physical relationship. Once again, these are categories that are later imposed upon the world, but the initial function of intentionally capturing the world includes, for example, values, correct? The way the world initially appears to a subject, the way a certain circumstance acquires subjecthood, in a sense, is by being valued. There are things that are valued more than others, things that are valued differently than others. If I hit my desk, it doesn't hurt. If I hit my hand, it kind of does. The difference there is a difference in the way things are presented, and the way values are presented to the subject. Now, why is this so important when we come to consider the nature of nature? As I hope you've noticed by now, this leaves us with a very different concept of what being human is. Keep in mind that most ethical theories are constructed by beginning with the idea that only human beings are ethical subjects, or only rational beings are ethical subjects, or only beings endowed with will are ethical subjects. The point here is none of that is an essential condition for being a subject, correct? What is a subject? It is a circumstance that has the characteristic of suchness. It is a function. It is a function of the environment being manifested to itself, in a sense. We are part of our environment. There is no, basically, ethical theory tends to limit itself to what's behind the skin or beneath the skin. The point here is that is an artificial limit, correct? The limits of my body are not the limits that separate humanity from nature. Humanity is nature being directed itself. I think my 50 minutes are over, and I think we've had a fair amount of metaphysics. So just as a final comment, this all seems very difficult when we're trying to handle it. It seems to defy traditional thinking. Juan Camilo has already mentioned Nishida, and I believe Nishida offers a very interesting way of trying to capture the philosophy involved behind the limits of humanity and nature. Nishida says somewhere that traditional Western logic, very influenced by Western languages, is a logic of subjects, correct? The subject is essential and predicates are lumped upon the subject. Nishida says that's not the way the world works. We need a logic that actually captures the fact that in order to be a subject, I need a predicate. I need something to be said for me. But at the same time, predicates, in order to exist, need a subject upon which they are predicated. None of these has ontological priority. Quite on the contrary, they both exist thanks to the other. According to Nishida, the most adequate ontological logic, you'll excuse the redundancy, would be a logic of tensions, a logic of predicates trying to determine themselves into subjecthood and subjects trying to elevate themselves towards predicatehood. Only when there is a field, a space, a basho that manages to encompass the possibility of this dynamic tension, can there be such a thing as a subject or a predicate? Hopefully, that sounded very much like what I was saying a moment ago, correct? What would the human be in this sense? The human would be the determination of the environment, or the environment determining itself into subjecthood. Of course, the consequence, the conclusion, and I'll finish with this, would be that it makes no sense to talk about an ethical theory meant for humanity or an ethical theory meant for nature. They are one and the same thing, and any ethical theory that forgets this duality, I believe, is bound to be a misconception. So that was what I was going to say. So the plan now is the three of us will have about half an hour of internal discussion. Keep in mind, anybody who has questions, either in the English version or the Spanish version, can write them in the chat on YouTube, and they will read them further on. But please ask as soon as you have a question, so you won't forget. I don't know if either Roman or Juan Camilo has something to ask one of the others, or a comment or criticism. Roman, please. Roman, go ahead.
Yes. Many questions and comments for both of you, actually. By the way, for everybody watching, we didn't know what we were going to talk about, so this is not arranged, just so you know. It's not a setup. It's honest and sincere. So, because the first speaker was Juan, I do have a comment. I do have some notes here, and actually a couple of questions. So, you were talking about effective ecology and about your research, which was ethnographic research, right? If I understand correctly, Juan, right? And I remembered something came to mind that has been on my mind for a while now. I'm sure you're familiar with the notion of deep ecology, and Arne Næss, who's a Norwegian philosopher who, I think it was in the 70s, he started talking and writing about this notion of deep ecology. And he has a list, I don't have it right here right now, but he has a list, if I remember correctly, of 8 principles that he considers fundamental for this idea of deep ecology. And in his books, in his writings, Næss, when talking about deep ecology, one of the things that he says is that he suggests there is no universal frame. So if you're going to start thinking about environmental protection and conservation movements and so on and so forth, there's no universal method of doing that. So he's saying you have to look into the local, what's happening there in the local community, in the local ecosystem. If you try to to protect a river, for example, or a forest, you have to look at that particular place where that forest is and understand its situation and the relation that the local community has with the forest and so on and so forth. So he's arguing, he's not the only one, but and the whole deep ecology movement is trying to do this. So arguing for this sort of applied local solutions, let's say, or thinking when it comes to conservation efforts, right? And I was thinking about that when you were talking. But because you mentioned, you talked about effective ecology, I also remembered Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson, and so on and so forth, who are considered, the pioneers of the ecology movement. Who in their writings, I always felt that there's this affective side, if you want. There's this part that focuses on emotion and on our connection with a certain place or with a certain natural phenomenon. What I wanted to ask you is, I'm sorry, I'm trying not to. So many things. Yes. So my question is, to finish my idea. So Aldo Leopold and deep ecology. What I find problematic with deep ecology is that he does suggest we should do that. He also suggests not Aldo Leopold, but Arne Næss, I'm sorry. So Ness, deep ecology, the 8 principles. There's also the suggestion there that since you don't have a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, you cannot have that when you're talking about environment. It's important to look at the local community, but at the same time, if you want to understand or redefine the relation between human beings and nature, they suggest we should also look into other philosophical traditions. So they're trying to, Ness at least, is suggesting that we should go beyond Western philosophy and look into Asian philosophy, for example, or African philosophy, and more than that, look into the community to also try to find some philosophical precepts or concepts within the local community. Even if the community doesn't think, like, for example, you mentioned Don Pedro, he's probably not thinking, oh, I'm doing philosophy right now, but maybe he is, right? So there is this suggestion there in the deep ecology movement, but I feel that it kind of fails to do that. So deep ecology, the whole movement, Arnes and the others, they do argue for this, but I feel that there's still a lot more than that can be done there. So I think I would say that this is one of the areas where deep ecology still has to work a lot. My question was about something that you said toward the end of your presentation, when you talked a little bit about an effective notion of ethics. If I am correct, if I understood correctly, and I think you mentioned. I wanted to ask you more about this effective notion of ethics. I think you mentioned reciprocity as one of the tenets of this notion of ethics. Intimacy. I think maybe there's something else that I'm missing. I didn't have time to write down. More details. That's basically what I'm asking for about this effective notion of ethics.
Okay. Thank you, Roman, for the question. And let's say, because it's interesting that you mentioned deep ecology, because I think they opened the gate in a way from Western philosophy, from the perspective of Western philosophy, one gate in order to talk about this kind of approaches. And I remember they were always emphasizing this notion of transpersonal ecology. I think it was very important for Ness, and how from that transpersonal situation and engagement, then naturally it will flourish this conduct, these actions that suppose this experience of non-self, right? So that the deontological aspect of deep ecology came from the experience of this transpersonal self, right? But it's true. It's very philosophical, right? What I found, despite the fact that I was trained in philosophy, I did fieldwork, right? So what I found in fieldwork, in ethnography, is that maybe it has as a background these ideas of deep ecology. But how it works, how it functions from the local, as you say, right? And it's different in every place. It's totally different in every place, despite the fact that in many of these traditions, they speak of the non-self, of this experience of connection. But for us, let's say Westerners, despite whether we like it or not, it makes like noise, right? So what I found in this affective side of things, then I found the terminology to talk about these things. But what I found is like the connection that people has with place, and they express the connection of some of them, not all of them. In Spanish they may call it arraigo, or I found it, I don't know how to translate arraigo, but it was like this vitality of place vitality. Because I asked them, why do you stay here despite the bad economic conditions, for instance, right? Although there was war in the place where I was. It was a peaceful zone, quote unquote. So vitality was the term that came from people. And I was thinking how I conceptualize this vitality, because it's not that they feel vitality. It's not like the individual self that feels vitality, but it's something that they found in it. They express that. It's like this forest make us be in this flow of vitality. Of course, they use other words, and I am doing a translation. So from that, I was thinking, well, how can I theorize vitality? And this is something that is going beyond bodies, right? And it's something that you may or may not feel. There was another statement which was, I won't be very longer on this, that is this place is unique, and what you feel in this place, you don't feel it in other place, right? So there is a singularity of place, right? That is related to this affect of vitality. So that is where I found interested Nishida, because as Felipe was saying, this allows us to try to put things from the perspective of the logic of the predicate rather than from the logic of the subject. Mm-hmm. And is this place that unfolds qualitatively, which I translate as vitality, right? And this is a flow that the thing is that before relations between entities, yeah, right, there is this active emplacement, and that is super weird for me. I'm trying to understand that, because we tend to think between entities, then after that there is relationships. But the interesting thing with Nishida is that Basho is unfolding, and those relationships between entities are determinations of place. So there is this intimacy that is between Don Pedro and coffee plants. There is this intimacy that is the result of the Don Pedro and the coffee plant being determinations of that particular place. So it's like in differential geometry, there should be ways of understand this and topography, I think so. But is that every place is different, and it has a specific and singular affect. That's what I am also talking about emanations. So is this affective side of things that at the end is the result of the determinations of place that allow me to try a different maybe definitions of ethics. But it's interesting also the point of Felipe that maybe we don't need ethics, or maybe how I mean, ethics presupposes this dichotomy, the traditional notion of ethics, but how can we think in ethos, right? Emerging from the territories, right? So, of course, we cannot, in this sense, we cannot talk about codes of conduct, right? That like deontological codes of conduct, but we can talk about, for instance, a logic of care in relation to place that is derivative from this intimacy, and that is what I found in the empirical context. Something along those lines, Roman. I hope I respond.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I also have a question for Felipe, if that's okay, time-wise.
Yes. Go ahead,
Yes.
please.
I'll try to be brief. Comment or very brief comment, because you talked about Buddhist philosophy and you mentioned Dogen. This is actually something that I find fascinating. It's something that I've started looking into recently. And when you were talking about Dogen and his reflections, I remembered, I think I would add Kukai to the list. He's also very interesting as a philosopher, and he writes about many different topics. And in the context of environmental ethics, one of the things that Buddhist philosophy can contribute to this whole discussion is the perspective that they have on Buddhahood, for example. For people who are not very familiar with Buddhist philosophy, Buddhism, Buddhahood, or Busho, as they call it in Japanese, is the idea that basically all of us have the potential or the essence of the Buddha. We have this potential of becoming Buddha. We have the potential for attaining illumination. To put it simply, there's a whole debate in Buddhism: who has this Buddhahood? Is it only human beings, or is it only is it only sentient beings, or do you include non-sentient beings in this? And in this context, I remembered this quote from Kukai. I'm sorry, I only have the quote, but I don't have the references because this is something that I actually used in one of my Japanese philosophy classes to discuss with my students. So there's this quote from Kukai, and he says, if I may, he says, "If trees and plants are to attain enlightenment, why not those who are endowed with feelings? If plants and trees were devoid of Buddhahood, waves would then be without wetness," he says. I can provide the quote and the reference later if you want. But I just wanted to say that Kukai seems to suggest that, of course, those who are endowed with feelings, that's human beings, that's sentient beings. But he says trees and plants, if trees and plants are to attain enlightenment. So he extends this, the possibility of attaining enlightenment, so Buddhahood, to non-sentient beings, and trees and plants. He actually starts from this assumption. If trees and plants can attain Buddhahood and human beings can attain Buddhahood, that gives us a whole new conception, understanding of he's basically suggesting we're the same. He's basically suggesting there's no difference between me and tree and plants in this sense, that we can all attain Buddhahood. And for Felipe, I found your discussion of your definition of the subject really fascinating. And again, I thought of Kukai. He says at some point kind of the same things. He suggests that I think it's from that text. So he has a text where he talks about, I think it has been translated as realizing Buddhahood in this body or in this very body or something like that. And he says something like, subject and object appear to be distinct entities at first sight, but in actuality, there's nowhere any subject or object. So there's no distinction between subject and object. And there's a whole discussion there, and basically suggesting that the world is just consciousness, it's just mind. And that's why you don't have the distinction between subject and object. My question was about, I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time. My question was about the nature of the subject. You talked about thusness and suchness. and you said, if I remember correctly, that we should reconsider our position that only human beings are ethical subjects. I hope I understood correctly, because in fact, in actuality, the subject is just a circumstance that has this character of suchness, or as you put it, thusness, right? Is that, did I understand you correctly? Is that what you wanted to say, or?
Yes, it is. Shall I elaborate, or I mean, did
A
you
little
finish
bit.
your question?
Good. Yeah, I'm done. Yeah.
Okay. First, in a sense, I'd like to go even further than Kukai. No, I feel Dogen goes much further than Kukai, though perhaps he hasn't always been interpreted in a similar manner. And in a sense, this is something I feel, for example, Nishida fails in, because Kukai and Nishida uh, extend Buddhahood, extend subjectivity, but always to the world of life, correct? They extend the frontier, so ethical theory seems to encompass all living things. But I believe that is not enough. Um, and in a sense, we have to go back to Schelling here. Schelling used to say that if we are to understand the nature of nature, we need to understand how life emerges from nature. Nature is the condition of possibility for life. And so when I say that circumstances endowed with thusness or suchness become subjects, uh, basically, it's everything. You can be alone in a room, and that is a circumstance with suchness. I'm reminded constantly of a saying by Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, who used to say, I'm going to try to translate this. I am I and my circumstances, and if I don't take care of them, I lose myself. Um, that is the way I believe we should understand it. No, nature, in as far as nature is not life, but in as far as nature is that which creates the possibility of life, and being alive is nothing but nature reflecting upon itself. So this wouldn't be idealism, it wouldn't be materialism either, because as I said a while ago, matter is a way of approaching nature, correct? Nature, if I may, nature is sort of a logical space. Nature is the logical space that allows for further determination of subjects according to predicates, in order to put it in Nishida's terms. So yes, and I have an ethical responsibility towards this pen, in a sense, and as far as this pen is part of the circumstances which I am. Evidently, things behave differently. This doesn't pretend to make everything homogeneous. We don't have the same responsibility towards the whole of reality, the same kind of responsibility. We'd have to go into details, but that would need a very long time, basically. But the idea is, let's stop separating life, humanity from nature, life from material or physical nature, etc. Because all of these separations tend to do is to create a part of my circumstances which I try to push away from myself. Correct? And in that pushing away, not only am I denying part of my responsibility, and that has become the evident environmental disaster we are now living, but it also affects me ontologically. Correct? It's I don't know if you know that there's a series of psychiatrical conditions in which people lose control, in the sense, of part of their bodies. They live thinking, for example, and this is I'm paraphrasing a very disturbing case of somebody who used to thought that their left hand actually was their aunt's arm. Somehow they had gotten confused. She had taken her aunt's arm, attached it, and her aunt's arm did things she didn't want to do. Evidently, her life became a mess. In a sense, this is an ontological mess. It is a mess because I am denying part of what I am, denying the material world, denying the unethical character to the material world. I believe is something similar. I think, I hope I answered your question, rather.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question or comment. I don't know. It's like for Roman, if you can elaborate more on this notion of reciprocity, because I was wondering if that notion of reciprocity is maybe, I mean, I know it's a different time, but there is the notion of symbiosis, of symbiosis in biology, where two different organisms become establish a relationship of becoming, of co-constitution, but the notion of symbiosis also suppose in a way that this reciprocity is not totally equal, right? It could be in a way some kind of parasitic relationship, from instance, from two different kinds of cells and amoebas. There should be, they may be like a parasitic relationship, but they still are in condition of reciprocity in a way. So I mean, so the question is if this I lost the name of the philosophers. This Shoki, Undo Shoki, was thinking, how was this reciprocity? It implies some kind of homogeneity, of perfect reciprocity in between two entities, or we can think through with him with the differentials of power. Is that possible in the sense of wiki? Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, thank you. The concept that I mentioned, which is the concept of mutual natures, is actually a concept that Shoiki himself coined. The word in Japanese is go-se, so it's a word that Shoiki invented, and you write it with the two ideographs. The first one means reciprocity, so it's the adjective tagai, otagai, for example, that you also use in modern Japanese, and the second one is a ideograph that means nature or characteristic, and so on and so forth. This is the most common translation of gose. It's mutual natures. It was established, I think, about 30 years ago, when Shoiki started to be translated into English. It was actually used for the first time by Herbert Norman in the 1950s. There have been attempts to, how do I put this, improve this translation, because mutual natures is a little bit problematic. As you said, I think this is where your question comes from. This reciprocity, it can work in multiple ways, and of course you can have reciprocity with hierarchy or with a relationship of power. So that leaves some kind of ambiguity to the term. But for Shoiki, it's reciprocity, it's equality. It's the only thing that can work in nature. So he's a very vocal critic of the social system in his time, and he criticizes, he chastises the existence of any kind of hierarchy in society. And his premise is that we as human beings can only be equal. So, for example, we're talking about, as I said, Edo period Japan, when you have this really complicated social structure with the daimyo, the feudal lords at the top of the pyramid, and the shogun, and so on and so forth. And Shoeki says this is nonsense. This isn't the way the world should be. So he excludes from the start all power relationships. And so mutual natures seems to remains a little bit ambiguous, because it has this connotation that there can also be a relationship of power there, but there isn't. So one of the terms that has been used lately, which personally I prefer, is actually mutual independence.
Mutual
Independence, yeah. In the sense that men and women, they are in this relationship of mutuality, but at the same time, they also exist as independent beings, and they are not in a relationship of power, or nobody has ascendance or power over the other. So to answer your question, it's full reciprocity. It's complete equality in the relationship there.
Thanks.
Although I'd love to ask both of you a lot of questions, I think I'd rather read some of the public's questions first, so that we don't run out of time. But sort of a small advertisement in the middle. I forgot to do this at the very beginning, and now I'm feeling terribly ashamed. I would really want to thank our simultaneous translators. One of them, Jenny Castro, comes from Balestra Editorial, who's done an amazing work of translating Roman. Roman, she's your official voice in Spanish now. The others are Professor Carlos Barbosa and Juan Camilo. Simultaneous translation is neither easy nor entertaining, so we appreciate the effort. And now I'm going to start reading the questions from the public. So, Juan Camilo Palacios Bernal asks, I have a question for Professor Roman. Does the concept of hito and the idea of the mutual or reciprocal nature imply a reduction in the capacity of the individual of being an agent?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, that's really an excellent question, and it's something that has bothered me for some time, and I've started looking into it. So if I talk about the self, this whole idea of self and mutual natures, and Shoiki's understanding of the human being, at some point you're bound to come across the issue of agency. What do you do about the agency? What happens to the agency of the self, subject? And my answer for now to that, I'm not sure it's my definitive answer, but for now, my answer is that we're dealing with a little bit of a paradox here. So I mentioned mutual natures or mutual independence as the relationship that is established between all these elements of nature. I should talk a little bit slower for the translator. I'm sorry. Okay, for the interpreter. Okay, but there's another key concept in Shoiki's philosophy, which is Choko. I hope Felipe can send it to everybody. So Choko is usually translated as straight cultivation or direct cultivation. And this is, I hope you got it, Felipe. So this is a concept that
yes,
it kind of informs Shoiki's understanding of the relationship between human beings and nature. So literally, the concept means straight cultivation or direct cultivation. And the second ideograph in the concept is the verb tagayasu. in Japanese, which actually means to till the land, to plow the land, to work the land. So physically to do agriculture. That's the first meaning. So for shoeki, this chokko designates all activities of labor or production. And that means how should I put this? The concrete physical things, from tilling the land, harvesting the crops, so the agricultural part. But at the same time, this concept of chokko is also used in a broader sense. And it kind of refers comprehensively to the sum of all creative activities. How should I put this? All the tasks and actions that underpin the existence of all forms of life. And that includes human beings or plants and so on and so forth. So it's moreover, in Shoiki's description of the world, the human being is seen as a microcosm at the same time. So because the human being is part of nature, it also represents a reflection, a reproduction, a continuation of the ontological movements of nature. So what happens within nature at large, the macrocosm, also happens within the human being. What regulates this reflection, this continuation, this reproduction, is chokko, is straight cultivation. Now, keeping that in mind, so what happens to the agency? Because that was the question, right? Paradoxically, it would seem that if we consider that the human being is part of nature, just on an equal footing, on an equal plane with all other elements of nature, from other human beings to plants to animals and so on and so forth, then it would seem that there is no agency to the human being, to the human subject. But because that relationship is also regulated by chokko, what happens is that a human being actually relinquishes the agency to nature. So there is an agency, but it's not, because you don't have a self as an individual self. You have a self with others, or you have a self with everything. So that agency is relinquished from the individual self to nature, which is for Shoiki not a bad thing, so to speak. It's not it doesn't mean that you're agentless or agency-less as an individual subject. It just means that relinquishing your agency to nature is actually a form of freedom. It's the only way in which you can exist within nature. I hope I answered the question, but this is what Shoei would suggest about this.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if
we have another question. Yes, of course.
No, it reminds me of the Kitaro Nishida concept of inverse activity. And I wonder if that is a trend in the Japanese tradition of thought, where, as I understand, inverse activity means that our actions are at the same time the self-negating activity of the world, right? And it's more like a question that I have, because I'm still struggling with this apparent contradiction between individual agency or agency from the self and this larger process of agency. So I think Nishida answered the question with this notion of self-contradiction of the world as it manifests, as it unfolds. But I want to point out that this is something that our Western tradition of thought is like a barrier there. You know, if we think in terms of what we are doing is kind of this conversation between philosophies, it's supposed the elements that are difficult to translate, or that the things that we don't understand, and in practical terms, you know, in terms of ethics, in terms of policy, people will ask, I mean, so what is agency? who can we blame, right? Or who is the actor, the main actor in this environmental conflict? So I think that I believe that it's just a tricky question for that connects different, and I think that's the challenge of these transcultural spaces that we have, and is that the future of philosophy. I will say that's a advertisement. The future of philosophy is the creation of these dialogues among different worlds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You were going to say something, Roman?
Yeah, and yeah, if just yeah, I do agree with you that this is the future of philosophy. We have to do this. We have to do this. To answer your question very briefly, I don't know if it's a tendency of Japanese philosophy. It might be something that has to do with Buddhist philosophy and its influences. I keep thinking about Kukai because I've been reading a lot of Kukai recently, and he talks about the. I mentioned earlier the realizing Buddhahood in this very body, and at some point in the text he talks about the body, and he says that this body is that body, and the Buddha of the body of the Buddha is the body of the sentient beings. The bodies of the sentient beings are the Buddha's bodies. So my body is the Buddha's body, and the Buddha's body is my body. There are many ways of looking at this quote, of course, but one of them is through the lens of the idea of agency. If my body is the body of Buddha, the Buddha's body is my body. My agency is the agency of Buddha, and Buddha's agency is my agency. So I think it's of course, in Buddhist philosophy, they don't use the notion of agency. They don't use the notion of self. It doesn't mean that the concepts don't exist. And we have here another problem that you mentioned, which is the problem of translation. How do we translate these concepts? How do we make them familiar to somebody who is, for example, not versed in Japanese philosophy? But that doesn't mean that the concept, the ideas, the notions don't exist. I'm going to stop talking. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I'd like to add a little something to this discussion before we continue with the questions. So I was reminded, like Camilo was speaking, of Lao Tzu's idea of Wu Wei, sort of a non-acting action in a sense, but that's also a very difficult one to translate. And I honestly have no clue what Lao Tzu was thinking of. Interpreting him correctly is very, very difficult. Interesting, but difficult. But I think it is an invitation to understand something that we don't usually include in agency. We tend to think of agency, once again, in a very detached sense. We tend to think of agency as what something does from the outside to something else. Correct? We tend to think of human agency as humans poking their fingers where they shouldn't. Nature is okay when we don't put our hands inside of it. And I believe this is a very unfortunate conception of agency, because the solution in this sense would be to step away from nature, correct? Leaving nature to her own agency, when we think of it in these traditional terms, would be, sort of turning our backs on nature and going, I have no clue where. But there is something else, and I believe this has something to do with Wu Wei, which has to do with agency as an internal phenomenon. Agency not as a way of acting upon, but agency as a way of determining oneself. In a sense, conceiving of things in a certain way is already acting as an agent. In fact, the very moment when I think of nature as something outside of me, towards which I might have a responsibility, and which might be, useful for me or beautiful or etc. Even before I start acting, I have already acted. In a sense, I am already an agent, in as far as I have broken up different parts of reality. So I believe if we're going to have this kind of discussion, we not only need to translate the concept of agency into Japanese and Chinese and etc. philosophy, but we also have to make sure that our own concept of agency isn't, unduly small. Okay, so that was my small drop in this conversation, and let's read another question by Maria Alejandra Herrera Palacio. She says, I understand the concept illumination as wisdom. I have read various Buddhist texts, and they explain the concept as a virtue or value, but this concept has many meanings. Now, does illumination have a relation with the concepts qi in Chinese or ki in Japanese? Does nature have wisdom? Does nature determine the human being, or does the human being determine nature? Once again, this question is for all of us. So, who wants to bite the bullet on this one?
I'll try to be brief if I can go first. There are various understandings of illumination in Buddhist philosophy. It differs across time and with different thinkers. Personally, I wouldn't equate illumination with wisdom. It's not necessarily wisdom. In the sense that wisdom, for example, is something that you accumulate, it's something that you acquire in time. There's a whole process there. Illumination is an instantaneous thing. There's a beautiful metaphor. I think it's Dogen, whom Felipe mentioned, who has this metaphor of the drunken men. And he says illumination is like waking up from a drunken stupor. It's still you, but you're totally different. So imagine you go out drinking, you get so drunk that you pass out, but then the next morning you wake up and everything is clear and your mind is clear and you can see clearly. It's a very simple metaphor, but it explains what illumination is as an, something that occurs like that. As for, I think the second part of the question is really fascinating. If nature has wisdom, if it determines human beings or vice versa. If I ask Ando Shoiki about this, he would say that there's nature determines human beings and human beings determine nature because it's a never-ending cycle for him. It's beginningless and endless. And everything is connected. Everything is interconnected. There's no end. There's no concept of time, for example, in his philosophy, because everything is, how should I put this, very fully rounded in a beautiful arc, and he doesn't necessarily talk about wisdom, but I would say he considers nature to be nature. The term he uses for that is shizen, which is a Japanese word for nature. He does see it as a basis for ethics, not necessarily endowed with wisdom, but as a basis for ethics, for aesthetics, and all other human activities. Human activities can only be part of nature. So everything that humans do is found in nature, whether it's art, whether it's whatever. That's it.
Juan Camilo, would you like to add something?
Well, I certainly am not an expert in Buddhist philosophy, but I remember some things from Juan Po, which is most like a Zen Buddhist master, and Juan Po reminds us of illumination as that is. It's something similar to what Ruben says. I think it's something that appears in the here and now, right? Here it is, he says, but also has to do with the operations of the mind. That, in a sense, when we don't pursue the effort of seeking illuminations, there is the road for that, but it is not also motionless. Yeah. So is this, I don't know how to think it, because I am thinking, I'm not like really into that path. But is this, it made me think of how we think about the mind and how we can get, whether or not we can get rid of this mind activity, perpetual mind activity, which is also, I mean, it reminds me of something that I catch up in Berkeley, which is the interesting conversation between neuroscientists and Buddhist philosophers and philosophers of mind, which is something that is well, we in the conversation of World Philosophies, philosophy of mind is something that is very important. And I am remembering now the book of Attention Not Self, which I always mention, which is Ganeri, and I think is a great path to connect that conversation with philosophy of mind. And the other thing that I would like to say is, in Kitaro Nishida's term, this notion of dialectic, right, which is not the Hegelian dialectic that synthesize in a third term the opposites, but it's something that he mentioned the continuity of discontinuity, and how we keep differences, but at the same time of keeping differences, we establish some kind of connection, right? And thinking in the last part of the question was this notion of how is the relationship with the environment. So the dialectic allows us to understand this relationship in which we determine the environment, but also the environment determined us, right? But it's not that we like create some kind of third term that that synthesize the other two dialectical opposites, but it keeps the dialectic alive, right? Dialectic keeping differences and contradictions. So, well, that something along those lines.
Well, an answer to the question. I agree with Roman that we must keep wisdom and enlightenment apart. There is another story found in Dogen's writings. He's talking about when Bodhidharma asked his disciples what the essence of Buddhist teaching was. And, several disciples gave very sophisticated theoretical answers, and Dogen, acknowledged their answers, very good, you're on your way. And then Hui Ke, one of his disciples, stood up, turned around, came back, and sat exactly where he was. And Dogen said, you understood Buddhism. That is the essence of Buddhism. The point here is enlightenment would seem, enlightenment isn't an acquisition in sort of informational terms. You don't acquire the sentence that is enlightened in this sense. No, you don't. Once you're enlightened, you're not able to answer the question, what is the ultimate nature of reality, by doing anything but doing this. This is the ultimate nature of reality. Enlightenment, according to Dogen and several other philosophers, Japanese philosophers, seems to be a change in the way we are here. Not a propositional change, if you want to use contemporary philosophical terms. It's not propositional information. It's a change in the way of being. And in a sense, if anything at all, it's losing information. In a sense, it's saying, the hair and childhood and etc., that's not really me. It's there, but we don't care about it. So first, that point. The second point regarding whether humans determine nature or nature determines humans, I think that in order to answer that, we need to decide where we're standing first. In a sense, I'd say, for example, the question makes no sense, basically. humanity and nature are determinations of a condition of possibility. We determine our circumstances determine themselves in such a way that they can either become human in nature or determine themselves in such a way that if you're lucky enough to be enlightened, or so I've heard, I'm evidently not enlightened, the division stops existing. So yeah, that would be my answer. Now, technically, we should stop at 7. As far as I can see, we have 2 other questions. So if both Juan Camilo and Roman agree, we can take 10 minutes and answer very, very quickly the next 2 questions. So one of them is by J. Felmar, J. Felmar, or something, and it's to everybody. If the common background to humans and nature is a reciprocal codependence or relational metaphysics, isn't it possible to think nature without us? In case of a negative answer, isn't it an implicit but strong, still defense of the place of humans in nature?
Roman.
Yeah, I think it's possible to think nature without us, to imagine nature without us. I think it's actually one of the things that we have to do. And I think, unfortunately, we're probably going there, like with the pace, the everything that changes around us, and climate change and everything. I think this is where we're heading. So I think we should start imagining that. I think, yeah, nature is possible without us. Since we have the power of imagination, it's something that we have to do. We need to do. We need to imagine what it would look like without us. But in serious terms, I mean, yeah, okay, people imagine this in science fiction movies, for example, and disaster movies and novels and so on and so forth in fiction. But we also have, I think, to think about this very seriously in a philosophical way and imagine what the world would be without us. So, and for example, to give just one example, we now talk about environmental ethics because we presume a world in which we exist, a world in which we are included. But what would environmental ethics look like if we are not in nature anymore? We are not in this world anymore, as the question suggests here. And I think it's something that we should start thinking about, because it might give us a new perspective on ecology and environmental ethics. That would be my brief answer.
Yeah, and I think it made me think. It made me think in the notion of finitude, of human finitude as well, which is very, in a way, contradictory to this broad tale of progress, of eternal progress, right? And I think the excessive positivism in our tradition of thought, right? Not only in this sense of scientific positivism, but in the sense of our deep engagement with the metaphysic of being, right? That negates or that excludes the notion of non-being, right? It's something that is changing. It's something that needs to be changed, and thinking through finitude, thinking through death as well. We need to think in death in a new way. And I think I don't want to be a romanticist or exoticist but the Latin American cosmologies, of indigenous cosmologies, there is a different take on what is to be dead, what is the meaning of death, and it's something that we need to think. I just point that.
Yes, I think my answer goes with both of your answers, and it evidently has the evident conclusion is yes. Nature doesn't need us specifically. Once again, if we take nature as a condition of possibility for our own existence, you know, we are the condition of possibility for skin diseases. If we stop existing, skin diseases stop existing. If skin diseases stop existing, we don't, fortunately. Basically, I believe it's the same way with nature. Nature, I believe, tends to think about itself, in a sense, reflects upon itself. Nature is a dynamic process involved with nature. One of the results of that dynamic process seems to be rational conscious thought. But the disappearance of rational conscious thought doesn't mean that the condition that made it possible will disappear as well. No? So yes, we have to start thinking about that. We usually, our traditional ethics conceives of nature as that which we can use for our own profit. So nature plays, sort of a secondary role. We have to realize that we need nature. Nature doesn't need us. So I mean, if somebody's got to be, responsible here and take things seriously, it's us. And the last question before we run out of time by Diana Rosas. This way of rethinking ecology, nature, and even our existence through a style of thought that has its origin in Japanese philosophy, how would it contrast with contemporary art, specifically in bioart and references such as Eduardo Kac or Sterlach? I am very interested in your opinion. A question of any of you who may like to reply. Thank you in advance. Does any of you want to begin?
If I may.
Of course.
I'm not very familiar, I have to say, I'm not very familiar with bioart or Eduardo Kac, for example. But referring to with reference to the first part of the question, so how would it contrast with contemporary art? That brings us to our definition of philosophy. It depends on it depends what we understand by philosophy. I personally have a very open definition, a very open understanding of philosophy. I think of philosophy as a way of life, if you want. It's not something like an academic discipline that you only do in these ivory towers that are isolated from society. Philosophy is something that is connected with the way we live, the way we are in the world. We are doing philosophy right now, for example, which means borders are very blurry. Distinctions don't make a lot of sense. Why should I make a distinction between that's also a problem with not only Japanese thought, but East Asian or Asian thought in general. We think, for example, in Western. It's hard to define Western, but let me use the term. We think in categories like philosophy, religion, and literature, whatever. We tend to think of these as separate categories, right? But are they really separate categories? If I find interesting ideas in Plato, I may as well find really interesting ideas and philosophical ideas and concepts in Victor Hugo, for example. I think we should go beyond, we should move beyond these categorizations. They can be useful because it's easier to talk about stuff if we use categories like, oh, this is literature, oh, this is music, oh, this is philosophy. But in real life, in the real world, I believe there's no clear-cut distinction between one and the other. So to go back to the question, if we understand philosophy to be this open discipline or field or way of life, that I don't believe there's a conflict or a contrast with contemporary art, or whatever kind of art. You find philosophical ideas in art, you find artistic ideas in philosophy, and so on and so forth. I believe there's an interpenetration there, intermingling, and constant dialogue between all these different ways of expression, because this is what they are in the end. I'm done.
Well, I don't know if I have an answer, but I just remember I'm very interested in these notions of nothingness, absence, emptiness. Actually, there was in 2019 with co-students, we organized an event. We invite artists, physicists, philosophers, anthropologists to think with these three notions, starting with the idea that we are embedded in this metaphysics of being. So there was very interesting people. Karen Barat was there. She's a philosopher and a theoretical physicist, and she has a very interesting notion of nothingness, that struggling with time, that deal with the notion of time. And so the artists that were there, one of them works with holes, for instance, showing in our everyday life and our rooms, in our architecture, the relevance of holes, and holes also in our body. And she was doing a feminist perspective. So that was one. And the other one was doing theater with silence and working with sounds and with a musician. And the other thing that I remember now is this in a Ground Zero memorial in New York, in the where the World Trade Center was. So there are two pools where water goes through a vacuum, right? So I don't know. It's just that we need to think in terms of absences. Is that's something that Western tradition of thought haven't talked very well. Even post-structuralist continental philosophy, Deleuze is full of being. Everything is rhizomatic and relational, but it is full of being. It's that, there's a similar notion there, the virtual, but he is trapped in this metaphysic of being. So that is something to be done. And I think art, of course, goes faster, right, in working with these new challenges. Yeah.
But in order for my answer to make sense, once again, I believe that we need to increase our notion of agency. We are agents when we think of things in a certain way. Now, keeping that in mind, my experience is that nothing is as good when it comes to changing the way we think of things as artists. Basically, I could summarize it like this. Thought is a system. I think we all kind of know that. Thought is, in a sense, a language. And changing the way we think about things usually means changing the possibilities allowed to us by our language of thought. And now, usually when we do, at least academic philosophy, we are constrained. We are constrained by syntactical, semantical, etc. rules. Artists are not only constrained in that sense, but good artists, at least, are expected to break those rules. Good art, or so I believe, usually doesn't have answers, it has questions, but those questions have to do with, why don't we think of things like this? No? There's a metaphor I'm constantly tormented by. Comes from Stephen Crane. I'm going to quote him wrong, but you'll get the idea. Somewhere he says that love is like a cigarette thrown into a urinal. and well, it torments me precisely because I'm not quite sure what he's saying, but somehow it makes sense. Somehow it makes me say, wait, we always think about love in, hearts and roses and everything's pink. Um, but then when he describes love as a cigarette butt and urine and etc., and the bathroom dirty, and I add a lot of unnecessary information, uh, it makes sense. Something in me says, wait a second, this has something to do with what you've lived, not the way you thought about love, but the way you've lived it. Uh, I hope Freud isn't among our audiences. I shouldn't have said that. But anyways, so yes, I believe this has to do with art because art is the best way to capture these ideas and not only reflect them, but expand them much farther than we philosophers are usually capable of doing. But anyways, I'm afraid we've run out of time. So first of all, I'd like to thank the audience. You've done great questions, by the way, wonderful questions. Once again, I'd like to thank our translators, Jenny Castro from Balestra Editorial, Carlos Barbosa and Juan Camilo Cuervo. Of course, I'd like to thank Juan Camilo Cajigas and Roman Pasha, who have given us a lot of their time for this discussion and have shared much of their wisdom. I believe this is a correct application of the word. And just so you all keep it in mind, the idea is for there to be a similar conversation to this one once a month. So, keep in tune or whatever you say in YouTube. Will give you information about our next conversation very soon. Hopefully, I don't know if Roman or Juan Camilo want to say anything.
Well, just thanks very much. I hope these conversations continue. And as I say, this is the future of philosophy.
Just one quick thing. I already subscribed to the. Mhm. Exactly. Yeah, I already subscribed to the YouTube channel, so I'm looking forward to the next conversations. Thank you for having me on this one, and a big thank you to the trans and the audience.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I'm going to cut the live broadcast once again. Everybody, thank you, and hope to see you